Target, enemy king. Part 1. King in the center. The enemy king presents a perfect target, slow-moving and very valuable. Unfortunately, he is usually very well defended by pawns, especially in his castle position. I want to show you on this tape how you can sometimes attack early on if your opponent makes a slip with his pawn defenses, and how to attack later by wrecking the pawns around his king. To show you the importance of pawn cover, let's look at the shortest game possible. Have your board set up in the start position. White 1 pawn to f4, black pawn from e7 to e6, white pawn from g2 to g4, black queen from d8 to h4, mate. How did black win so quickly? Above all because white lifted the pawn cover to his king. From the cassette on opening play, you'll have learnt that a good way to open the game is by playing 1 pawn to e4, and then black might answer pawn to e5. These are good on the grounds of development and central control. The movement of these pawns, however, does expose the kings, and if castling doesn't happen quickly, they could fall under attack. Both camps have a weak spot in their position. With black it's the f7 square, and with white it's f2. This square is only guarded once, and it follows that if the enemy can attack the square twice, with 2 pieces, say, he could conquer it if his opponent neglects to defend it, and this very frequently happens. You get many beginners' games continuing after 1 pawn to e4, black pawn to e5. The next move would be bishop from f1 to c4. Black plays bishop from f8 to c5. White plays queen from d1 to h5. If you remember about the queen from the tape on openings, if the opponent brings her out, look to see all the directions she attacks in, and see if you have anything unguarded. So switch off and see what the queen attacks here. The queen attacks h7, f7 and e5. h7 is already guarded, but f7 is attacked twice and only defended once. e5 is not defended at all. The best way to defend is to play queen to e7 here, but you could also try queen to f6, because that move not only defends the weak spots at f7 and e5, but also attacks against white's f2 square. When I was a schoolboy, I used to win lots of games with this double attack on the f7 square. Eventually, some opponents cottoned on, so I tried another way. From the start, I would play 1 pawn to e4, black would play pawn to e5, then I'd play bishop from f1 to c4, black bishop to c5, and now rather than give the game away with 2 queen to h5, I would play the move queen to f3 instead. Many a player would fall for that one as well, and my next move would be queen takes f7 mate. These early attacks with the queen, as you know, are not really the best way to begin a game, and a good player will drive your queen away with a small gain of time. However, there is another early attack which you can try in the opening, called the knight and bishop attack. It won't mate so quickly, but it will usually give you a big advantage against other beginners. Back to the start again. Begin 1 pawn to e4, black pawn from e7 to e5, white knight from g1 to f3. This attacks the e-pawn. Black defends with knight c6, and white plays bishop from f1 to c4. Now here, if black plays bishop c5, you cannot play your knight and bishop attack, because if you play knight g5 here, the black queen will just capture the knight. However, if instead of playing bishop to c5, black plays knight from g8 to f6, which is a good developing move, you can now swing in with knight from f3 to g5. Positionally speaking, this is not a marvelous move. Does it not move the same piece twice to an exposed square? Yes, it does, but this is material chess, and against anything but the finest defense, you should come away with bags of enemy loot. Let's say you're black here. What does white threaten, and how would you defend against it? Switch off and decide. As predicted, white has now a 2-to-1 attack against the f7 square, and it looks like the only way to defend it is by queen from d8 to e7. But then white can still play bishop takes f7 check, and if black captures, queen takes bishop, white knight takes queen, black king takes knight. White has won a queen and a pawn against a bishop and knight, 10 points for 6. Of course, after bishop takes f7 check, black should not capture the bishop, but move his king to d8, and white has gained only a pawn, but he's also prevented black from castling. With the black king stuck in the center like this, you should have a good chance of a successful attack. If you castle, bring your rook to the center and try to open the central files with pawns. That's your overall master plan. Now let us return to diagram 1. Let's assume that your opponent manages to find the best defense here, and instead of playing black queen to e7, he plays pawn to d5, blocking the attack to the f7 square. White plays pawn takes d5, and once again there's a chance for black to go wrong. Black's best move is actually to move his knight from c6 to a5, but it's not obvious, and quite likely he'll play knight from f6 takes d5, recapturing the pawn. Then your knight on g5 is under attack, but instead of retreating or defending it, you can play knight takes f7, the famous fried liver attack. Usually it's not worth giving up a piece for the attack, but by this little combination you can drag the enemy king right into the center of the board. Black captures king takes f7, and now how would you play as white here? Switch off. Well, try queen from d1 to f3 check. This is much stronger than checking on h5, because there's a double attack upon the king at f7 and the knight at d5. Now in order to get out of check and defend the knight, black must play king to e6. But now his king is right in the middle, and if white can possibly open the e-file and get the black pawn out of the way, then a rook check could be very dangerous along that file. Now white increases the pressure with knight to c3 here. Black defends his knight with knight from c6 to b4, also, by the way, attacking the c2 square. White plays queen e4, defending c2. Black pawn to c6, and white pawn to d4, with a very powerful attack for the piece due to black's king in the center. By later castling and bringing his rooks into the game, white should be able to increase the pressure along the central files. These early attacks on the f7 square can catch your opponent unawares, but if you are black, you should learn enough from this tape to be able to avoid it happening to you. For example, if you're black and the game begins, if you go back to the start position, pawn to e4, pawn to e5, white knight to f3, black knight to c6, white bishop to c4. Here you can play knight from g8 to f6, as long as you know what the correct answer to knight g5 is. Otherwise, play bishop to c5 and not knight to f6. And if white castles now, then you play knight to f6. Now at this point, white knight from f3 to g5 is harmless because black can simply castle, and his rook defends f7. Many players as white are now tempted to capture at f7, considering that after bishop takes f7 check, rook takes f7, knight takes f7, black king takes f7, they've got a rook and a pawn, which is 6 points, for bishop and knight, also 6 points. However, if this happens to you, you should be delighted. A rook and pawn are hardly ever worth a bishop and knight, especially in the middle game, when rooks find it hard to become active due to the mass of pawns on the board. Even on a clear board, bishop and knight are easily better than rook and pawn. Another way to keep out of trouble with your king in the opening is not to apply e7 to e5 as black. Let's go back to the start again. Play white pawn from e2 to e4. And let's say black plays e7 to e6 here. Now in this position, the move bishop from f1 to c4 is pointless, as there's no attack on f7. Also, from the start position, if white begins one pawn to e4, and black plays pawn to c5, again white bishop to c4 could be answered by pawn to e6. And then black threatens also to play d7 to d5, expanding in the center at the expense of the bishop. In fact, because of the dangers in the early moves to the kings, especially to the black king, I'm surprised that beginners are taught to answer e4 with e5. However, as it's very popular still, I better tell you about the pitfalls, which I have done. Don't forget, anything you learn can be used both ways. You can use it against your opponents, and you can avoid it when they try it on you. Now, the next main danger that can occur after the moves white pawn to e4, black pawn to e5, is a possible attack along the open e file. Now let's see how the file can get opened. From the start position, e4, e5, white knight from g1 to f3. Now, instead of defending the pawn, black plays here knight g8 to f6. It's a good idea attacking the white e-pawn. If white now plays knight takes e5, black should first play pawn to d6 and then capture at e4. Let's see what happens if black grabs. Knight takes on e4. This is before playing pawn to d6. So the central e-file is open. There are two knights on it, but no pawns. Whoever gets to the file first, with a queen or rook, will be able to harm the enemy king. White plays queen to e2. The knight is attacked. And what do you think would happen if black just retreated his knight from e4 to f6? Switch off and decide your answer. Well, white goes knight to c6, and it's a discovered check that wins the black queen. So replace the white knight at e5 and the black knight at e4. Even if black plays pawn to d5 to defend his knight instead of moving it, then white can play pawn to d3, which forces it to leave. With best play, black can reduce his material deficit to a pawn, but this example here shows you the dangers along an open e-file. Here is another example. play white pawn to e4, black pawn to e5, white knight to f3, black knight to f6. Here white actually defended his pawn with knight c3. Black played pawn b6. For some reason white didn't capture the pawn at e5. He played pawn to d4 here. Black played e-pawn takes on d4. White knight takes on d4. Well, the e-file is now half open, not entirely open. Black now played bishop from c8 to b7. White played bishop from f1 to d3. Black went bishop from f8 to b4. Black is playing very logically. He's attacking the pawn at e4 twice, that is by his knight at f6 and his bishop at b7. White is defending it with a knight at c3 and a bishop at d3. But as the c3 knight is pinned, the pawn is in danger. Now, do you see a tactical way to defend the pawn? Yes, lo and behold, white simply castled here, and black walked straight into the elephant trap. Black played bishop takes c3, white pawn takes c3, black knight takes e4, white bishop takes e4, and now black bishop takes e4. Now came white rook from f1 to e1, and black is faced with the loss of a piece due to the fact that if his bishop moves, his king would be under attack. So black played pawn to d5, but after white played pawn from f2 to f3, his piece was still lost. That is, black's piece was lost. So remember the open central file. You may have use for it one day. Our third major danger to the enemy king arises along the h5 e8 diagonal, or h4 e1 if it's in white's camp. Now let's go back to the start and play white pawn to e4, black pawn to e5, white pawn to d4. Now it looks logical for black to defend the pawn by pawn to f6. But in this position I want you to find two positional reasons and one tactical reason why this move fails. The first positional reason is that playing pawn to f6 takes away the natural square of the black knight on f6. The second reason is that after white plays bishop from f1 to c4, black's king will find it hard to castle, as the bishop strikes along the diagonal to g8. The tactical reason is that after black plays pawn f6 and white plays not bishop to c4 but pawn takes e5, black recaptures pawn takes e5. Now white has got queen to h5 check. This is the third major disaster that can happen to black's king, and this is a real disaster. Let's see what happens if black moves his king. He plays king to e7, white queen takes e5 check, black king to f7. And how would you now play as white? Switch off and decide. You should play bishop to c4 check, and to ward off mate next move, black must play pawn to d5. White bishop takes d5 check, black king to g6, white queen to g3 check, black king to h5. All the same, the black king could hardly be more exposed than he is now. Return to diagram 2. Now black could also try pawn to g6 here. But after white plays queen takes e5 check, and black goes queen to e7, white can now play queen takes h8 and pick up a rook in the corner. Well, don't think that this sort of disaster can happen only to black. Carelessness with the f-pawn can bring retribution to white too. Let's go to the start again. Play white pawn to e4, black pawn to e5, white pawn to d4, black knight to f6. One game might go white pawn takes on e5, black knight takes on e4. Here white should play something like bishop to c4. But what if he innocently tries to eject the knight with pawn to f3? Switch off and decide your answer here. Black comes in now with queen to h4 check. And if white plays king to e2, then queen f2 check gives black a tremendous attack. But what if white doesn't move his king? What if he plays pawn to g3 here? This seems to stymie the attack. Switch off and decide what you would do here. However, we now see a very typical combination. Black plays knight takes g3, white pawn takes g3, and now black can either win the exchange with queen takes rook, or he can continue the attack with queen takes g3 check. I consider in this position it's better to play queen takes rook, and then you can go back and continue the attack, having extra material as well. So, watch out for these three types of attack that can be used against the enemy king early in the game. The attack on f7, the attack down the central file, and the attack along the h5, e8, or h4, e1 diagonal. Part 2. The fence. In most of your games, you and your opponent will be able to castle, and the king will find greater safety than in the centre. Then you must decide whether to launch an attack or whether to go for some other positional objective. For a good kingside attack, you need several pieces, near or pointing at the enemy king, at least 3, and one of them should be the queen. Without a queen, you cannot make a good attack. Secondly, and this is most important, you need to weaken the enemy pawn formation. Now, what do we mean by weakened pawns? To understand this, I want you to imagine an electric fence guarding some valuable stronghold, with guards and rifles and savage dogs placed on or around it. We can imagine the pawns as the electric fence, and the pieces as the human or animal guardians. Now, clear the board and place 3 black pawns on h7, g7, and f7. Put a white bishop on d3. The bishop is now ready to capture the pawn at h7. But now appears a black king at g8, and the pawn is guarded. OK, we put a white queen at h4. The threat of capture at h7 is renewed. Black now materializes a knight on the f6 square, and h7 is immune. White is not done. A rook comes to the h1 square. 3 pieces now attack h7, and only 2 defend. Will it fall? Hardly. Black has so far only used his guards to defend with. He has not yet switched on the fence itself. Black now plays h7 to h6. Now the pawn at g7 defends the pawn at h6. Seemingly an electric current passes between the 2 pawns, and the defence holds. If white captures at h6, he will lose his queen. In order to break through the fence, 2 main methods are possible. One is to smash the fence, and the other is to probe it, first at one point and then at another. By luring the fence forward, it eventually loses its power to hold off invaders, or it may stretch so thin that the invaders can infiltrate through the holes in the net. Let's see some examples of the first method. If you have diagram 3 on the board, now place a white bishop at b2. Play bishop takes on f6. Black must recapture or be a piece down. But after g takes f6, his fence is completely smashed. Not only is the g file open, but the pawns have lost the capacity to defend one another. It's as if a wire had been cut. Now, not only can the pawns not defend one another, but they cannot defend the squares near the king, on the h and the f files. In this position, the white queen crashes in with queen takes h6, and there's already a threat of mate at h8. The fence can also be smashed by the sacrifice of a unit. Reset diagram 3. And now put the white bishop at c1, not at b2. Play white bishop takes on h6, black pawn takes h6, white queen takes on h6. This is a similar procedure to the last one. Here white is again broken through, but at greater cost, and black still retains a defending knight. In these sorts of cases, the attack needs to be pretty strong to justify the loss of a whole piece. Well, that's the demolition process. Now let's look at the more subtle probing method. Set up diagram 4. Here we start the ball rolling with knight from f3 to g5. The threat is queen takes h7 mate. We suppose that black has no guards at his disposal and must move a pawn forward. Let's say he plays pawn from f7 to f5. Now white continues queen to d7. And with the queen and bishop combined, there will be a mate at g7 soon. Note how an immediate queen to d7 before the f pawn had moved wouldn't have been any use to white, but now the fence has been weakened, been brought forward, queen to d7 forces mate. Good. Return to diagram 4. Play once more white knight to g5. Black this time defends with pawn to g6. How do you now play as white? Switch off and decide your move. Now you can probe the weakness along the central diagonal with queen to d4. White now threatens queen to g7 or queen to h8 mate. Black blocks with pawn to f6. Okay, what's your next move? Switch off here. It looks at first sight that your knight is attacked and must move, but you can ignore it and now sweep in behind the fence with queen from d4 to d7. This threatens mate at h7, and if black plays f6 takes g5, then white will finish with queen to g7 mate. Notice how important the queen is with this sort of attack, because she's such a maneuverable, such a mobile piece. You can, of course, combine the smash and grab raid with a rapier attack. Return to diagram 4, but instead of a bishop at b2, put a bishop at e2. Right, again, play here white knight to g5. Black defends with pawn to g6. Here we switch our queen over to h3, queen to h3. And black must now defend with pawn to h5. Now, instead of trying to probe further, you can now smash the barricade with bishop takes h5, pawn takes h5, white queen takes h5, and the threat of mate at h7 is renewed. Now we shall see how these attacks can develop in an actual game with all the pieces. Set up diagram 5. In this position, white would like to play bishop takes knight on f6, but black would not helpfully play pawn takes bishop, but would play queen takes bishop. Therefore, white finds a way to force black to recapture with the pawn. How would you play? White should play knight from c3 to d5, and now black has no way to give added support to his knight, as the bishop, which could defend by going back to e7, is locked out of the defense at c5. Even a good bishop can be bad. Black played bishop to e6. White bishop took on f6. Black g-pawn took on f6. Of all the pawns in front of the king, the g-pawn is the most significant. It is the linchpin which holds the other pawns at h7 and f7 together, and defends the vital f6 and h6 squares. White now comes in with queen from d2 to h6. If you remember the earlier cassette about opening play, I stated that the queen as a long-range piece did not have to be far advanced to be effective. This is partially true. However, if you make a long-range attack, you only attack in one direction. But if you're close up, as the queen is here, she can strike in three directions. She strikes towards h7, g7, and f6. Advancement here has led to enhancement, and this has been made possible due to the weakened pawns, so the white queen is not exposed on h6. White's main threat is mate in 2. Do you see it? Yes, knight takes f6 check, and if black plays king to h8, then white would continue with queen takes h7 mate. So black would have to give up his queen to avoid this happening. Now, to stop knight takes f6 check, black played bishop takes on d5, white bishop takes on d5, black king to h8. Now, consider this position and decide how you would continue your attack. You cannot immediately win in this position, even though black is in difficulties. You need to bring in more forces. Actually, both your rooks and the knight at f3 are not in the attack yet. The white knight cannot move to g5, but the secret of these positions is to look for various invasion points on the files where the pawns are weakened, in this case the h file and the f file. Now here you could play knight from f3 to h4, and you're planning to move in onto f5. So play knight to h4, black goes knight to d4, that stops white's knight f5. You see how black's having to use his guards to keep the white pieces out rather than the fence itself. He's not getting much help from his fence. Now white brought his rooks into action with king to h1. This doesn't seem to get the rooks into action, but actually white can't play pawn to f4 immediately, because his king would then be in danger of a discovered attack from the black bishop at c5. So he plays king h1, black plays pawn c6, white plays bishop to b3, black pawn to d5, white pawn to f4, and white retains the advantage due to black's inferior king position. Now for the demolition sacrifice. Set up diagram 6. Here white played queen to h3. Can you see what he is threatening? Yes, it's bishop takes knight on f6. Black queen or pawn takes bishop, and then white queen takes h7 mate. To defend against this threat, black answered pawn to h6. but white snapped it off with bishop takes h6, black pawn takes h6, and white queen takes h6. Now usually a queen and bishop should not be enough for a successful attack, even against a king exposed as this. Don't forget that black still has several pieces near his king, even though the fence has been destroyed. Here this is no exception. The knight at f6 prevents white playing queen h7 mate. White needs reinforcements, and these are supplied by the rook, which threatens to come to e3 and then to g3. And this makes the white attack very strong. Now for a probing attack. Once again, you need a lot of pieces to make it stick. Set up diagram 7. Here black has a rook on an open central file, centralized knight at d4, queen and bishop pointing at g2, and a knight at f6 and a bishop at e7, which could also be quickly brought into the attack. So far, no holes have been made in the fence, though the defending knight at f3 has been forced to take up a poor spot on e1 to defend the g-pawn. Black now turns his attention to the h-pawn. He played queen to h5, white played bishop to b2, black played bishop to d6. An interesting example of probing now occurs if white defends with pawn to h3 here. Can you see it? Switch off and decide how you would play. Black could play here queen to e5, threatening queen to h2 mate. White plays pawn to g3, and now black goes queen from e5 to d5. That threatens queen to h1 mate or something like that. White plays pawn to f3, then black plays queen to g5. This threatens the g-pawn again, and if white plays pawn to g4, then queen to h4, and black is gradually filtering in through the holes in the king side. His threats are now queen to g3 check and queen takes h3. Oh, and black could also play queen takes knight instead of queen to h4. So let's now return to diagram 8. White in fact played pawn to g3 to block the attack. And what would your next probing move be? Yes, the move black knight to g4 is very strong. This threatens queen takes h2 mate. White defends with pawn from h2 to h4. Now you can attack with pawn to g5 to break the barricade, but can you see an even stronger way to smash through the king side? Switch off here and think about it. Perhaps you found the brilliant queen takes h4. Black's attack is so strong that he can afford to give his queen away. After white pawn takes queen, black plays bishop to h2 mate. A stunning attack, but one based on a tremendous build-up of forces against the enemy king, good probing technique, and a crowning demolition sacrifice. You may have noticed in these last examples how the rooks usually take a back seat. This is because it's difficult to open files against the enemy king without exposing one's own king. So the rooks, if they're going to get into the attack, often have to move up via the center onto the third rank and then go sideways, or maybe they move all the way down to the enemy's second rank and then once again move sideways. So this is somewhat clumsy maneuver. You're not able to directly put your rooks into action. Now there's an exception when you can open the F file, and if you remember from diagram 6, white eventually played the move pawn to f4, and this didn't expose his king too much. His king still had two pawns protecting it at h2 and g2. So if you can open an F file, then sometimes you can get your rooks into action that way. Now we're going to look at a situation when the rooks really come into their own, and this is when opposite castling happens. Now, when players castle their kings on opposite sides of the board, attacking play gains an extra dimension, because you can advance pawns against the enemy without exposing your own king. This serves two purposes. In the first place, the pawns can exchange, and thus help to eat away the enemy fence. Secondly, every exchange opens a file, which allows the rooks to come quickly into action. For an example of this, set up diagram 9. The kings are on opposite wings, the pawns are ready to march, and white wants to play pawn to h4 to h5. Then exchange for the pawn on g6, and this will open up the h file, on which he already has a rook. Unfortunately, black wants to do the same sort of thing on the other side. He wants to advance his pawn from b7 to b5 to b4, and exchange it for the pawn at a3. It's a question of who gets there first. Just one move can make all the difference in this sort of position. Play white pawn from h2 to h4. Black pawn to a6. White pawn to g4. Black pawn to b5. White pawn to h5. Black rook to b8. White pawn takes on g6. White opens first. Black plays h takes g6. And white now plays bishop to h6. It looks like black has been too slow. White threatens now to play bishop takes g7. Black king takes g7. White queen to h6 check. Black king to g8. White queen to h8 mate. Back now to diagram 10. Black tries now to get his own attack going and ignores white's attack. He plays pawn to b4, hoping that white will play pawn takes on b4, then black can play queen takes b4, when black is now threatening a mate, this time at b2. But white ignores him and plays bishop takes g7, to which black replies pawn takes on c3, threatening now to capture white's queen with check, as well as to play pawn takes b2 check. With both sides teetering on the precipice, white now sees a win, which he plays with rook to h8 check, black king takes g7, white queen to h6, and this is mate and the end of the game. So, there are some of the criteria for a successful attack against the enemy king. Several pieces, especially your queen. I've also shown you three of the main methods of attack: demolition, probing, and file opening against the pawn fence. Also driving away, capturing, or exchanging the guards. Don't think that you'll be able to win by attack in all your games. Some positions are just not worth it. Have a look at diagram 11. Here the kings are serene inside their unblemished walls, with the knight standing on sentry duty. Not much enemy activity in the area either. You might as well look for other positional targets, rather than bang your head against a brick wall. Endgame play. When queens roam the board, no enemy king can feel safe, and enormous lengths are gone to protect the poor fellow, such as burying him in a hole and covering him over with pawns. Once queens have been exchanged, he rises from his coffin, and the fewer pieces there are on the board, the safer he feels. As a piece, the king is worth more than a knight. He can be worth up to 4 points in the endgame, so you must remember to use him. We learned from the cassette on opening play that pieces usually work better in the center, and this applies to the king too. Don't leave him in the corner, but bring him into battle. In fact, do exactly the opposite of what you do in the middle game and in the opening. Now I'd like to answer the question, what is the endgame? When does it occur? Well, most people say it's when the queens have been exchanged, but this can be a bit misleading. That's when the endgame begins, but the endgame has got two parts, the early endgame and the deep endgame. Now, set up the start position and play one white pawn to e4, black pawn to e5, white pawn to d4, black pawn to d6. White pawn takes on e5, black recaptures, pawn takes e5, and now white exchanges queens. Queen takes d8 check, black king takes d8. Now here, technically, we're in the endgame. The queens are off the board, but there are still a lot of pieces around. 6 pieces on each side. I don't count the pawns. Now, of course, it is much safer for the kings. They're in much less danger of being attacked or even mated, so they don't necessarily have to castle. All the same, I certainly wouldn't move them up into the centre of the board yet, and I'd give them some protection. And I wouldn't leave that black king on the open file. In fact, if I was black, I would start to play some moves like pawn to c6 and then king to c7. And then my king would be fairly safe on c7, be quite near the centre, ready to approach when more pieces become exchanged, and it wouldn't get in the way of the rooks as it's on the second rank. Now it's when the pieces really start to exchange off, and say you've only got about 1 or 2 pieces left on the board, we don't count the pawns again, and you've got the kings, then the king is in much less danger, and he can act just like any other piece. You don't have to bother about his safety. Now, what about this idea of putting the king in the centre? Clear your board completely. Just have a white king and put him, say, on e1. Well, here we can see at the edge of the board he's only got 5 squares. Now let's put him on d4. Well then, on d4 he's got a choice of 8 squares to go to. However, it's not as simple as that. Suppose we put him on b2. Well, he's got his 8 squares now, so wouldn't he be just as good on b2 as on d4? Well, this isn't quite true. On d4 he's much closer to every point of the board. Say you wanted to get to g7. From d4 it will only take you 3 moves. Or if you want to go to g2, this will only take you about 3 moves as well. Now, when you have the king on b2, it takes him 6 or 7 moves to get to any other part of the board, say g7, b7, or g2. And it's particularly with these slow-moving pieces, such as the king and the knight, that the effect of being in the centre becomes most noticeable. The other pieces, which can cross from one side of the board to another in one sweep, queen, rook, bishop, they like it better in the centre, but it's not so critical for them as for these 2 pieces, the king and the knight. For an example of how the king in the centre helped white to win a game, I want you to set up diagram 1. Now this is a position from the deep endgame. No pieces on the board whatsoever except the kings, and therefore that means the kings are in no danger. Of course, white has observed the rule of putting his king in the centre, but black still thinks the bombs are dropping, so he's sheltering at g8, and he's going to pay for this. Now, the first rule of the endgame is to use your king, and the second, even more important, is to try and queen a pawn. Can you see how white could go about doing this? Yes, he advances his king to c5 and then to b6, heading straight for the only undefended pawn in black's camp. Then he captures it, and next eats up both the pawns at a6 and c6, and then pushes one of his pawns through to queen. He could, of course, push all 3 pawns through to queen, and many beginners proudly say sometimes, I got 3 or more queens in my last game. Actually, 1 queen is quite enough to mate with, as long as she's helped by her own king. But if you're not good at it, then get 2. Now let's look at diagram 1 again. If black's king were on d7 and not on g8, he need not have lost. Had white then played king from d4 to c5, black could answer king d7 to c7, and white just can't get through with his king. Now, assuming both sides know enough to get their kings into action, the kings begin then to fight against each other. They can't attack each other directly, but what they do is to push and shove until one of them has to give way. Why one of them has to give way we'll discover when we look at diagram 2. Here there are just 4 pawns on the board, and what black wants to do is to move over and capture the 2 white pawns at h3 and g4, and then the way will be clear to queen his own pawns. But there's one thing in the way: the white king. How do we get rid of him? Simple. You just move straight up to him and tell him to shove off. You'll find this works like a charm, as long as the kings are opposite and it's his turn to move. So let's play king from d5 to e4. White's got no choice. He must move his king, as he hasn't got any other pieces to move. So he moves king to f2 in order to keep near his pawns. Black chases him, king to f4. The white king runs again, king g2. Well, black can't keep going sideways, but now he moves forward, king to e3. White carries on, backwards, king to h2. Black pushes forward, relentlessly, king to f2. White escapes into the corner, king to h1, and now black moves to g3, and there's nothing to do for white to save those 2 pawns, after which the other black pawns are going to queen. Well, that looked pretty easy. Let's return to diagram 2, but this time put the white king on e3 and the black king on d6. Now it's white's turn to move, and let's say he wants to capture the black pawns. So he's going to aim to get to f5 and then to get to g5. So in he comes. He plays king to e4, tells the black king to go away, and the black king does. Black king plays king d6 to e6. Now white notices something's wrong. He can't move into f5. Can't even go to f4. He goes sideways, king to d4. But black goes king to d6. And white realizes that he can't make any progress. If he now goes to e4, black goes to e6. And they carry on this dance until one side agrees a draw. So, white did something wrong there. Let's put that king back on e3 and black's king back on d6. Now, the secret of winning these positions is, in fact, not just to move forward, but to stand opposite the opponent. So we play king from e3 to d4. This is going to be the winning move. And this sort of position is called an eyeballing position. This is because the king is now looking straight in the eye of the opposite king, and the other king must give way. So black here must move his king, and he moves it to e6 to keep in touch with his pawns. But now white follows him. King to e4. Black plays king to f6. Now white pushes forward with king to d5. Black king goes to f7. White king to e5. Black king to g6. White king to e6. And so it goes on. Eventually, black is going to have to let go of those pawns. He goes back to h6. White goes to f6. The secret is always to keep dead opposite the opposing king. Black king now has to go to h7, and white picks up his pawns. So that's eyeballing. And don't forget, the secret is to put your king opposite his king and make sure it's his turn to move and not yours. If it's his turn to move, he's got to give way. Now, eyeballing is most effective in the deep endgame, when there are only kings and pawns left on. This is because as soon as you put other pieces on the board, they can move around, and then the king doesn't have to give way. Let's go back to diagram 2, but this time add a couple of pieces. Black bishop at d6, white bishop at f2. Let's push forward with our king. King from d5 to e4. That's the eyeballing position, but black doesn't give way. All he does is to move his bishop. Where should we put it? Maybe to e1. And if black plays king to f4, white goes bishop to f2. And at the moment, black certainly can't get in to win the pawns. I've spoken a lot about the kings, and here I want to talk about the pawns. Please have a look at diagram 3. And here we've just put up the pawns on the board, so we can think about them alone. Now, the most important thing for a pawn is that his way be clear of other pawns to the queening square. And if we look at diagram 3, we see that white's pawn at e5 has only got 3 squares to go. And there's no black's pawn in front of it. So white's pawn is called a passed pawn. Now, can we find any passed pawns for black? Yes, he's got one on d5, and that wishes to go through to queen as well. There's no opposing pawn. Now, of course, the enemy can put pieces in front of that pawn, but at least the first step has been done. You've got rid of the enemy pawns, and the next thing, of course, will be able to try and get rid of the pieces. Now, what about the pawn on c6? Is that a passed pawn? Well, it looks like a passed pawn because there aren't any enemy pawns in its way. But in fact, we don't call it a passed pawn because as it moves down the board, it can still get captured by enemy pawns. The white pawns on b2 and b3 are really standing in its path because, as you remember, pawns captured diagonally. So, that's one of the things we want to aim for in the endgame, and that's one of the reasons we go around capturing enemy pawns, just to clear the path in front of our pawns so as we can advance them forward to make queens out of them. Now, to show you how powerful passed pawns can be, we better have a look at diagram 4. Now, if you look at this position, both sides have got passed pawns. But here, white's passed pawns are separated by quite a distance, and black's are close together. Now, it's interesting that usually we like to have our pawns together. If you remember early on the cassette about opening play, we stated how good it was to have 2 pawns together in the center. In that way they worked together to control the squares in front of each other, and then they prevented enemy pieces from getting to those squares. But here is one exception when we like to have our passed pawns separate. That's in the deep endgame where you've just got kings. The reason is that the kings are very slow moving. They can only go 1 square at a time, and it's very easy to split them, to overwork them, make them have to go in 2 ways at once. Well, that's impossible for a king, as we're going to see how. Now, if it's white to play in this position, he moves his pawn from e5 to e6. Well, there's nothing in the way of that pawn, and there's only one way black can stop it, and that's to attack it with his king. He plays king e6 to d6. Okay, that's one gone. But now the other one moves through. Pawn a5 to a6. Now what's black to do? If he captures a pawn on e6, then in 2 moves, white's going to have a queen. So he's being a bit distracted. He plays king from d6 to c6. Now he hopes that if the pawn moves on to a7, he's going to be able to catch that one. Alas, white doesn't do it this way. White plays e6 to e7. And then black sees the other one's escaping. So he rushes back, king c6 to d7, just catching the white pawn in time. Just catching one of them in time, because now white plays a6 to a7. And black sees that he can't do anything to stop that pawn queening next move. So he captures the pawn on e7, king d7 takes e7, and white queens his pawn. And as you know from the finishing off cassette, white should have a fairly easy time winning this game. I would suggest, as you're still beginners, you collect up the two black pawns that are still left on the board with your queen and king, and then you gang up on the black king and mate him in the way that you've already learnt. Now, that was an example of how passed pawns can be very dangerous to the opponent. We're going to look now at diagram 5. If you can set that up on your board. Now let's see. Can you tell me what are the passed pawns? Well, in this position there's only one passed pawn, and that's a black pawn on b4. But this pawn is going to be a permanent threat, a permanent thorn in white's flesh, because it's always going to be threatening to queen. And in chess we have a saying, the threat is stronger than the execution, if you can work that one out. Here the pawn can't queen by itself, but we use an idea which you may have got from the last example, and that's the idea of decoy. We push the pawn a little bit forward, the white king has to run to catch it, then we eat up all the kingside pawns and queen our own pawn. So let's make the moves. Play black pawn from b4 to b3. Now it's only got 2 squares to go, so white king must chase. White king to d2. This lets go of the pawn at f3, and black plays king takes on f3. Now white might as well carry on and take the pawn at b3, so he plays king d2 to c3. Black plays king takes pawn on g4. White plays king takes pawn on b3. Now in these sorts of positions, the way to work them out is to do a bit of counting. You do counting separately for both sides. You count how many moves it's going to take black to queen his pawn, and then you count how many moves it's going to take white to capture the black pawn at a5, move his king out of their way, and then queen his own pawn. So let's do the counting for black. He's got a king on g4 at the moment. He's got to move it out of the way. That would take 1 move. And then he moves his pawn down to the queening square. That will take 1, 2, 3, 4 moves. So a total of 5 moves for black to queen his pawn. Now, how long is it going to take white to queen his pawn? King's on b3. It's going to take him 1, 2, 3 moves to get to a5. Then 4 to move the king out of the way. And then 1, 2, 3, 4 moves to queen the pawn. So that was a total of 8 moves. So in fact black is going to be 3 moves ahead in the queening race. Now let's just see how black actually wins this position after he's queened the pawn. Okay, let's make all the moves on the board. Black king goes from g4 to f3. White king to c4. Black pawn to g4. White king to b5. Black pawn to g3. White king takes pawn. Black pawn to g2. White king to b5. Black pawn queens. And white plays pawn to a5. Now turn off here and decide how you'd win this position for black. Now what you don't do is to move around with your queen checking the enemy king. That's just a beginner's way to play, and you're not a beginner. What you do is to put your queen in front of the enemy pawn so it can't queen. That's the first thing to do. You play queen from g1 over to a7. Now whatever white does, he's got no chance of queening his pawn. So what all white can do is to mark time a bit. Well, he plays pawn to a6. Now what's the second stage of your winning procedure? The second stage is to bring your king up and then to force the white king away from the defense of his pawn. This is done quite simply. Black king from f3 to e4. White king goes to a5. He's got to keep hold of his pawn. Black king to d4. Sorry, d5. Let's play this d5. White king to b5. Now, well, actually there's a clever way to win the pawn in a couple of moves. Can you see how? Well, I think if you play queen to c5 check here, white king must go to a4. And then, what's your next move? Then you play queen c5 to b6. And in this way, the white king cannot approach to his own pawn. So he's got to play, say, king to a3. You play queen takes pawn check. And you've won his pawn, and soon you'll be able to mate him with queen and king against king. You know how to do that. Now, that way of winning was pretty simple. But when you have these pawn races, and you've queened, and the enemy is just about to queen, or even vice versa, he's queened and you're just about to queen, then it can be a lot closer as to whether one side wins or not. I'm going to give you an example of this from the next diagram. Now, set up diagram 6. Now, this is an exciting position. It's black to play. What's your first move to gain the advantage? Yes, I hope you eyeballed him with king d6 to e5. And you didn't play king d6 to d5, because then white would do the same to you. He'd play king from e3 to d3. And in fact, that way, white would be able to save the game. Now, you've gone quite correctly with your king to e5, and white gives way. He plays king from e3 to d3. Now, before you go on, you count how many moves it's going to take you to take off the pawn at white pawn at g4 and then queen your own pawn. And at the same time, white is going to go around and collect up your pawn at b5 and queen his pawn. So how many moves does it take for both sides? Well, I make it that black plays 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 moves to queen his pawn. And it takes white 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 moves. Now, that means on the 7th move, we're going to have a position. And let's have a position with black's king on AH3, should we put it? No, let's put it on F3. Okay, black's on F3. And the black pawn is going to be queened on G1. Now, at this point, there's going to be a white king on c6 and a white pawn on b7, just one square off queening, and it'll be black to move. Now, with this sort of method of calculation, you'll find you're much more easily able to assess these sorts of positions, because it's very tiring in your mind if you have to first work out the black move and then you switch your attention over to work out the white move. It's better to work out the moves separately and then make a calculation to see who's actually got there first. Otherwise, you're saying black goes here, white goes here, black goes here, white goes here. And your mind's just not really not built for that sort of work. So, okay, we've got our position, and now it's your move as black. And how are you going to stop white from getting his queen? Well, the first thing to do will be to stop the pawn from getting to the queening square. So you play queen to g3. White king moves from c6 to d7. And now you play queen to b8. And the white king must go now to c6 and use the same sort of method for winning this pawn. You play your king to e4, white king goes to b6, you now go to d5, white king goes to a6, and you play king d5 to c6. You win that pawn, and then you queen you win with king and queen against king. Now I'm going to make it a little more difficult for you. Put the black queen on g1, a black king on f3, have a white pawn on b7 again. And now in this time, instead of having the white king on c6, I want him on c8. Now this makes it much better for white, because now if you play the move queen to g3, as you did in the last case, it doesn't stop the pawn queening at all. So, do you think there's a way to win this position for black, to stop white queening in some way? Have a think about it. Now, the method you have to use in this endgame is to use a series of checks to drive the white king in front of his pawn. And while he's in front of the pawn, you bring your king up one square. Then the white king hops out from under the pawn, threatens the queen. You chase him back underneath again. You bring your king up one more square. Eventually your king gets so close that you can mate him. Now let's see the method here. Now actually you don't drive him with a series of checks. You drive him with a series of checks mixed up with non-checking moves. I'll show you what this means. In this position with the black queen on g1, we start off with queen to c5, check. c5 check. Now, if white sticks his king under his pawn, then we move our king up one more square. So white doesn't want to do that. He plays king to d7. Now, turn off and decide what is your move here. Now, this is the bit where you don't check. You play your queen down to b6. That's threatening to take the pawn, and the white king moves from d7 to c8. Once again, he's threatening to queen his pawn. And at this point, you give your checking move. You play queen from b6 to c6 check. Now here, white hasn't got any choice. If he goes with his king to d8, you take his pawn off. So he's got to move king to b8. And now you seize your chance, move your king forward. You play king from f3 to e4. Now white again moves his king. And where do you think you should move it? Now it's no use moving it to a8. The pawn would still be pinned then. So to get any queening threats, white's got to go king to a7. Now what's the way for black to continue in this position? Well, black's quickest way is probably to play queen to c5 check. White goes king to a8. And black now plays queen to a5 check. White has to go king to b8. Now the king is in front of the pawn, so black goes king to d5. And once again white hops out, king to c8. Okay, what's your next move for black? Well, in this position, you better chase him back in. So you play queen to c5 check. King goes to d8. Queen to b6 check. King goes to c8. And now the move that pushes him in, queen to c6 check. King goes to b8. Okay, now we bring our king in again. We play king to c5. Black goes king to a7. We go queen to a4 check. Always look for the moves that force the king in front of the pawn. And the king now goes to b8. And now we're ready finally to approach with our king. We play king from c5 to b6. Hooray. Now white plays king c8. And what would you now play as black? Well, here actually you don't even have to bother to win the pawn. If you want to win the pawn, you can play queen c6 check, and then queen takes pawn check. In fact, you've got a mate in one by queen to e8. Well, these pawn races often happen, and it often happens you queen just one move before your opponent, and therefore knowing this way to win with your queen against a pawn on the 7th is very useful. However, I have to say that you've only got a 50-50 chance of winning actually with queen against pawn on the 7th, because if the pawn is an A, C, or F, or H pawn, then the position will be a draw. Let me show you why. Let's say it's an A pawn or an H pawn. So let's put a white pawn on A7 and a white king on B8, and we'll have the black queen on G1 and the black king on F3. Okay, this looks exactly the same as the last one. So we swoop in, queen to B6 check. And of course we're expecting white to move his king to C8. He doesn't do that. He quite freely moves his king to A8. So we move our king into E4, and he smiles at us because we've just stalemated him. Well, we couldn't do anything about that actually. It's just the pawn's on the edge of the board, and when the king goes in front of him like that, it's stalemate. Of course we can let him out, but then we wouldn't gain an extra move to bring our king up. Okay, well, perhaps we can try that trick against one of our opponents when we have the pawn and he has the queen. Now let's put a pawn on C7 and a white king on B8. Again, we're going to have black king on F3, black queen on G1. Now this looks a bit different. Doesn't look as though there's going to be any stalemates here, does it? Let's bring our queen to B6 check again. Well, this time we're expecting white to move his king to C8, and then we'll carry on with our maneuver. We're going to bring our king up. But he doesn't do that. He plays king to A8, seemingly abandoning his pawn. We capture the pawn. But what have we done? The king, the white king, has only got one square to move in, the square he's already on. That means it's stalemate. So far, our talk has been about queening pawns, queening passed pawns. And the way we've made them passed is to capture the enemy pawn in front of it, if the pawn didn't happen to be passed in the first place. Now, there's another way of making a passed pawn, and that's by using the pawn majority. Now here I'd like you to set up diagram 7 on the board. Now in diagram 7, neither side has got a passed pawn. However, both sides have got pawn majorities. Black has got 2-1 on the king's side, and white has got 3-2 on the queen's side. And in order to create a passed pawn, all white has to do is to play a4 to a5. So we'll make that move. Black has to take, pawn takes pawn, and white recaptures pawn takes pawn. And now we can use the same sort of methods as we've used before to win this game for white. The pawn at a5 is used as a decoy, and meanwhile white goes in on the king's side and eats up the two black kingside pawns and queens his pawn at g4. That should be the simplest way to win. Meanwhile, black is spending all his time trying to catch the white a pawn. So even if you haven't got a passed pawn, look out for the possibility of a pawn majority, because that may be a passed pawn in the making. Now we've looked at the deep endgame, where you have kings fighting against kings, just pawns on the board. Now what happens when there are a few more pieces on the board? Does this change the situation anything? Well, most of the ideas you've already learnt you can still apply. It's still important to have a passed pawn, because this is your aim, to get a queen, and it's still important to have pawn majority. Eyeballing is not quite so important, because you've got other pieces that the opponent can move, or you can move when your king gets into a fix. If there aren't many pieces on the board, then the checkmating possibilities aren't going to be very likely. Say you've got a rook or a rook and a knight on either side, it's not going to be that easy to checkmate. So once again, your main objective is going to be to win enemy pawns or try and queen your own pawn. Now we're going to see an example of a brilliant endgame from the World Championship match of 1937 between two world champions, Alekhine and Erve. Erve was the Dutch world champion. He'd won the title in 1935 by beating Alekhine, then offered him a return match, unwisely, because he lost it. And this was one of the games which helped Alekhine to recover his title. Now set up diagram 8 on your boards. Switch off and have a look at it. Who do you think is better in this position? Well, we've got equal material, and if we look at the pawn majorities, white's got 3-2 on the king side and black's got 3-2 on the queen side. So if white's going to queen a pawn, it'll probably be on the king side, and same, black will probably try and queen a pawn on the other side. Now we look at the pieces one by one, and we see that black's king is a little better than white's at the present moment. The rooks seem to be about even in strength. They both have an open file, both placed on an open file. Now have a look at the minor pieces, which are the bishop and the knight. Which one do you think is better? Well, there's usually an easy way to tell. You check to see whether the bishop is blocked by its own pawns, and here the white bishop has certainly got clear diagonals. It dominates about, well, it seems to be dominating about 12 or 13 squares. Won't bother to count them up. Seems to be dominating its full quota of squares. So the bishop is a good piece. Now as for the knight, a knight needs to be centralized if possible, or advanced. Now this knight is quite near the edge of the board, and it also can't get to the center square e5. It would like to do that, but Alekhine, who understands positional chess very well, has made sure that he's got a pawn on f4 which is preventing the black knight from getting into e5, and he's not going to move that pawn forward. If he plays pawn to f5, as soon as the black knight comes into e5, it's a good piece. Well centralized, and it cannot be driven away from its post by an enemy pawn. So positional chess in the endgame is just as important as in any other part of the game. Now it's this bishop advantage, the fact that the bishop is better than the knight, that gives Alekhine his main winning chances. And we'll see in this endgame how he uses the ideas that we explained earlier, trying to capture the enemy pawns or trying to queen your own pawn, and also using his king aggressively. So white kicked off Alekhine with pawn from h2 to h4, and this threatens to drive the knight to an even worse square. It threatens pawn to h5. Then the knight would have to go back to h8 or f8. And then it will be even worse place than before. So black played king c7 to d7. Here the black king in the endgame isn't in great danger, and the idea of this move is that if white now plays pawn to h5, the black knight would move to e7, and then it would possibly be able to come to d5, a nice central square where it would attack the white pawn at c3. So white here played king from g1 to f2, starting to use his king, bringing it close to the center. Black played his knight from g6 to e7. It's going to anyway have to move when white advances his pawn, and black hopes that he will get to d5. White continued here, king from f2 to f3, and black moved his knight from e7 to d5. So now the game seems to be poised on the knife edge. Black's knight has got itself into a strong post. It's threatening to capture white's pawn on c3, and then possibly even the pawn on a4. And then black's avalanche of pawns on the queen side is going to come through. So Alekhine pulls out all the stops now. He does everything in his power to get his own pawns on the king side going. So his next move is bishop c4 to d3, and this attacks the black pawn on h7. Black plays pawn to h6. White plays bishop to f5 check. Black move king back to d8. Now turn off and decide how you would play for white here. Well, Alekhine now decided to abandon his queenside pawns in order to get the kingside pawns through, and he played king from f3 to g4, using his king aggressively. And let's see what would happen if black actually went for the queenside pawns. If we play here for black, knight takes c3, white would play king to h5. Black could now play knight to a, takes on a4. White plays king, takes on h6. Black plays pawn to b5. White plays pawn to h5. Black plays pawn to b4. White goes king to g7. Black plays pawn to b3. White plays pawn to h6. Black plays pawn to b2. White plays pawn to h7. Now we see a very important difference between a bishop and a knight in the endgame. The white bishop being able to span the whole board is proving very useful in defense as well as attack. The bishop on f5 is able to stop the black pawn at b2 from queening. But what about black's knight on a4? Being a short-range piece, it really has absolutely no effect upon stopping the white pawn coming through to h7 and now to h8. And so even if black manages to queen his pawn on b1, white would even sacrifice his bishop for it in order to get his own pawn through, but black wouldn't be able to sacrifice his knight for the enemy pawn. Now let us return to the position of diagram 8a. Now Over studied this position for some time, but eventually he came to the conclusion that it would be no use for him to capture the pawn on c3, because he could see what was going to happen to him. He didn't need to work out all the moves. He just realized that his knight, being a slow-moving piece, wouldn't be able to get over to stop the white pawns. So, reluctantly, he went back into defense. He played his knight from d5 back to e7, attacking the bishop at f5, and he hopes to move his king underneath the knight over to the king's side to guard his pawns. Well, white moved the bishop back to b1. Black played king to e8. White played king to h5. Black played king to f7. White went bishop to a2 check. Well, black would here like to go king to g7 to guard the h6 pawn, but nothing doing. His knight on e7 would then be on prise, so he has to play king to f8. White played king takes h6. That's the first part of white's winning procedure. He's been able to create himself a passed pawn, the passed h pawn. Black now played his rook down from d6 to d2, hoping that his rook, in fact, would be able to win some of the white queenside pawns. White moved the bishop to e6. Black played rook to d3, now attacking two pawns, the pawn at g3 and the pawn at c3. Which pawn would you abandon? Of course, you let him have the c3 pawn, because you want to get a queen yourself. So you play pawn to g4, black plays rook takes c3, and now you play pawn from g4 to g5. Now look at this position and compare it with the sort of position we had right at the beginning of this example. You can see that white's been able to gain a passed pawn, and his pawns are really steaming down to queen, whereas black's passed pawns haven't moved an inch yet. Well, this was a triumph of endgame play by Alekhine, who shortly became world champion. Most encouraging for us is that he followed understandable principles, so if we follow these principles as well, we should also succeed.